Anyway, on to quick release versus slow release carbs. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, you brought up most of the rationale. I mean, you don't need, and the research shows this, you don't need like these high levels of insulin or even intermediary levels of insulin for a long period of time to get the effects that you want. Like, get a big burst, you get all the benefits, and you can avoid most of the downside with these huge spikes. And like you said, it ends up when you take these. So it's basically this: the longer cells are exposed to insulin, and it's not necessarily the maximum dose that they're hit with at a time, it's the exposure time that they're hit with. That's what really starts to push and set in these hormonal enzymatic changes within the cells that make them more adept at storing fat or whatever. So what you really want is is the limited exposure to insulin from a cellular level, which, you want the spike. The spike recalibrates, increases thermogenesis. I mean, it does all this great stuff. It's anti-inflammatory, so right after a workout, that's great. You can start to recover and, kind of optimize that hormetic effect of all the oxidation that you've caused during your training. So you want this big spike. You want to take care of all that. You want all your benefits, but you want it to end as quickly as possible, because the longer your cells are bathed in that insulin, the more tuned they become in the future to storing fat. So, that's why I hate the fact that, low glycemic is so heavily recommended. And I think that most of the research is misinterpreted for these recommendations, because you've got this long release of insulin. So your cells are bathed in a high level of insulin for a prolonged period of time. Well, guess what that makes your body really adept at doing? Storing fat. And it does not carry the same metabolic benefits of those big spikes. And then especially at nighttime, you're eating those low glycemic carbs, you've got that window of insulin that's elevated throughout the night, which then pushes off. Basically, it can destroy your entire circadian rhythm of hormone release at night, from growth hormone to cortisol to ghrelin. It can just totally fuck all that up sorry, I hope this isn't PG.
No, we have an explicit stamp on it.
A long time ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it totally destroys that for the evening. So, my thing is you want to be able to control exactly what's going on in your body as much as possible, which means, like, hit it, it's done. Now you can let your body reach homeostasis and let it do what it's best at, instead of trying to force it to do something that it doesn't necessarily want to do. And the reason I think these recommendations were made and they're so bad are from things like the Campbell-Oxford China study, things like that, where they looked at these populations that are eating extremely low glycemic food, but really they're just eating vegetables all the time that are a lot of fiber, some protein wrapped up in there, a big mix. It's not, they weren't eating foods that had a high glycemic load. They were eating very low glycemic load foods that were also low glycemic. And, research with diabetics has even shown the researchers themselves, these are experts in diabetes who are trying to help people make food choices. They're like, the worst parameter you can look at to try to control your diabetes is the glycemic index of the food. It's totally useless. And yet here we are pushing it to everybody every day for health, longevity, blah, blah, blah. I think it's just total bullshit all the way around.
So interesting, and just funny when you look at the kind of mainstream wisdom and all that. I had two things in my notes from when I was on your show that I wanted to bounce off of you. One of them is related to cortisol, like adrenal fatigue, cortisol issues. I want to talk to you a little bit about that. But before that, so when we're talking about carb backloading, we're wanting, just to circle around back to that, so we've got a situation, we wait until the evening when insulin sensitivity is lower, both in adipose and muscle tissue. Ideally, we do some resistance training. This increases like the GLUT4 proteins, which are going to pull glucose preferentially into the muscles. What about insulin sensitizing things like cinnamon and alpha lipoic acid and stuff like that? This seems like that would be a bad idea to use those because it's going to bypass this, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. I get these questions all the time because there's a whole family of supplements coming out now that are supposed to increase insulin sensitivity and blah, blah, blah. The question is, is this whole body insulin sensitivity that's being stimulated? If so, then you're shooting yourself in the foot by taking it. If they've shown, and I haven't seen this in any studies for this to be the case because it usually looks at glucose clearance, whole body glucose clearance, and not specific tissue disposal. But unless it specifically increases insulin sensitivity only in certain tissues, like muscle tissue, and not adipose tissue, you're just making you're basically destroying carb backloading.
You know what? Chris Masterjohn gave a great presentation at the Ancestral Health Symposium in Harvard back in the summer, and he made the kind of the argument that the precipitator for insulin resistance is wrapped up. Obviously, just high insulin levels are an issue, but we have this kind of metabolic consequence of ramming a lot of nutrients into the mitochondria. We start getting reactive oxygen species. You start getting damage in the mitochondria, damage in the cells, and so part of the adaptive mechanism is to become insulin resistant. And you can shuttle some carbohydrates or lipids into storage in fat cells and whatnot. But what's interesting to me, so a common treatment for type 2 diabetes is glucophage. It used to be sulfonylureal drugs, which are basically insulin mimetics and release insulin. But you've got an adaptive response, which is trying to forestall the injection of more nutrients into these cells because they literally are like burning up. Like you're creating reactive oxygen species, which are accelerating DNA damage, accelerating aging. So,
right.
Until you clean up the nutrient profile such that we're not in a hypercaloric state, not in this overt insulin resistant state. If you take a shitty diet, inject insulin sensitizers into that thing, it seems like it's going to kill people even faster.
Yeah. That was a section in the carb backloading book. I mean, insulin, has one job, and that's to make things grow. And when you look at everything that's happening in the body, even to the level of mitochondria, when you become insulin insensitive and start moving into type 2 diabetes, your body is doing everything possible to try to prevent you from becoming sicker and fatter. And then here we are, we give, metformin to people that then resensitizes these cells to absorbing insulin and whatever, which means they absorb more nutrients, which then forces people to reach a level of damage and obesity that I'm not sure they can ever come back from. I mean, that's the thing that scares me is I think we're pushing people with these drugs to the point that they might not ever be able to get healthy in the same way ever again.
Well, we've seen...
That's what scares me about it.
Yeah, we've seen Teradol from the National Lipid Association. She threw out this kind of no recovery point, triglycerides above 200, A1C above 6.5. If we see an individual with that, then she said that you can take it to the bank that 50% of their beta cells are done. Like they've succumbed to oxidative stress and they're done. Which then, I mean, you are then fighting this battle of keeping whatever insulin production that this individual has and maintaining that, or eventually they're effective. I think they call it type 3 diabetes now. Where the pancreas is just gone, but it's not via autoimmune reaction; it's from oxidative stress.
Right.
So
actually, Rocky and I had an interesting conversation about that because I've had a few people, and this was totally on their own. I didn't make this recommendation to them, just to be clear. They used Carb Night. They were type 1 diabetics who were, most of them had developed juvenile diabetes. And they actually, I only have 2 case studies in this point, so, not a lot of data points. But both of them actually got to the point that including their Carb Nights, when they would eat carbs, they're not using insulin anymore.
Right.
One of them's going on 2 months without an insulin shot. The other, I think, is at 4 weeks. No insulin whatsoever, even when they're eating carbs. So I would be incredibly interested to see what is going on in their body metabolically during those carb nights to know how they're surviving without their insulin, essentially, because general wisdom is they're done. They're not going to be able to process those carbohydrates appropriately without those insulin spikes, and they shouldn't be able to produce insulin, but something's going on there. I would love to get those people in for some data.
We've had a ton of similar feedback on type 1 diabetics, and there's a guy, Dr. Bernstein, he wrote a Bernstein's Diabetes Solution years ago, and he basically recommended a ketogenic diet with short exercise bouts throughout the day, which would, maybe not in the optimum, kind of carb backloading scenario, promote this, GLUT4 enhanced expression, but I think just empirically, the guy was really onto something. And, one of the interesting, the way that the type 1 diabetes thing got on my radar at all was a good friend, his girlfriend was doing CrossFit, type 1 diabetic, and she would hit these hard workouts, and then she would have blood glucose in the 200, almost 300s post-workout, which I was kind of like, what the hell is going on? And it took me a couple of days of thinking about this, and I was kind of like, okay, cortisol increases glycogenolysis. We get that spike in glucose, and so what we've had to do with these folks is get them to lift weights, to walk, and to be mellow, and to eat essentially, kind of cyclic ketogenic diet, and they've been able to, just shockingly decrease insulin bolus, but. It's so fascinating. If you dig around on my site, I think I've got 4 or 5 posts on type 1 diabetes and the mechanisms and some testimonials and all that stuff. But with the type 1 diabetes community, they go into hysterics at this suggestion. They become hysterical that there might actually be a solution other than eating carbs and then driving the road with insulin. Basically the recommendation is eat whatever carbs you want. We'll pick it up on the back end with an increased insulin bolus. It's just so interesting.
Well, yeah, I just think it's unfortunate because that's pushed so heavily at every level that you can't be healthy without a carbohydrate based diet, and until that message is really blown apart in the public eye, like nothing is going to get better in this country.
Right.
End of story. Like no matter how effective our grassroots efforts are, they will never rival that message from the top. We really need to blow holes in that somehow. And everybody's doing their little part, but there needs to be some way to coalesce and really just start pushing that message out there somehow. The healthiest people in this country are eating nothing like the dietary recommendations of the U.S. government.
Right.
That right there should tell people something.